The Galactic Imperium demanded tribute, humanity responded with war. The Herald ship entered our solar system at 0347 hours on a Tuesday morning, and by 0349, every government on Earth had been woken up. I was already awake. I had been awake for 36 hours straight, sitting in a deep space monitoring station on the dark side of the moon, watching the sensors scream at me. My name is Owen Garrett, and I was, at that particular moment, the first human being to visually confirm the arrival of an alien civilization. I pressed my face against the observation glass and stared at a vessel so enormous that it blotted out the stars behind it the way a hand blocks a candle flame. It was not a ship that had come to introduce itself. You could tell. There is a shape to things that come in peace, and this was not that shape. It was black and angular and covered in symbols I could not read, but the meaning of them was clear even across the language barrier. They were trophies. They were the marks of every civilization this thing had already visited, and the marks were not made in friendship. They were made the way a hunter marks a wall. My hands were shaking. I did not try to stop them. Shaking seemed like the correct response. The broadcast came 40 minutes later. It hit every frequency at once, every communication channel humanity had ever invented, from the oldest radio bands to the newest quantum link arrays. The translation software took 11 seconds to process it, and then the words appeared on my screen in plain English, and I read them twice because I could not quite believe what I was seeing. It said that humanity had been assessed. It said we had been evaluated by something called the Biological Cataloging Division of the Eternal Galactic Imperium, and that we had been assigned a classification. Tier 3. It said that Tier 3 species were recognized under Imperium law as sentient but pre-sovereign, which meant we were smart enough to be useful but not powerful enough to be treated as equals. It said that we were hereby invited to join the tributary system, which was not an invitation at all. It listed what we owed. Resources. Raw materials. A percentage of our agricultural output. A biological archive, which I later learned was a polite way of saying they wanted samples of our genetics. The first payment was due in one galactic cycle. Approximately 14 months. I sat in my chair on the dark side of the moon and read those words, and I felt something shift inside me. Not fear. Something older than fear. Something that had no clean name in English but sat in the chest like a hot coal. I forwarded the broadcast to the Secretary General's office and typed one sentence: I recommend we do not use the standard diplomatic acknowledgement template for this one. Nobody slept after that. The response took 6 hours to draft. 6 hours for the leaders of every nation on Earth to argue and debate and eventually arrive at the same place they had been heading since the first second anyone read that broadcast. The debate was not really about what to say. It was about how to say it without sounding afraid, because nobody was willing to sound afraid. Not in front of something like that. Not in front of a ship that wore the marks of 400 conquered civilizations like decorations. I was in the communications room when the final response was approved. The Secretary General, a quiet woman named Eleanor Voss, read it aloud before we transmitted it. She had a voice that did not waver. She had the kind of stillness that comes from making a decision and being completely at peace with it, even when the decision is enormous. She read 2 words. We decline. We transmitted them on every frequency simultaneously, the same way the Imperium had spoken to us. We sent it in every human language we had, and then we sent it in the 47 alien languages we had managed to translate from intercepted deep space signals over the past century of quiet listening. We wanted to make sure there was no misunderstanding. The reply from the Herald ship came back in under 3 minutes. It was short. It said that our response had been noted, and that a compliance delegation would arrive within 60 days to assist us in understanding our obligations more clearly. Then the Herald ship turned around and left. That was the moment I realized how little they thought of us. They did not threaten us. They did not warn us. They simply assumed that the compliance delegation would be enough. They assumed we would be like everyone else. They assumed the sight of that ship, the scale of it, the silent weight of it, had already done the real work for them. They assumed we were already broken. I watched the Herald ship shrink on the sensors until it vanished into the dark, and I thought about that assumption. I thought about all the civilizations that had looked at a ship like that and decided there was no point in fighting. I understood the logic. It was not cowardice. It was mathematics. When something is large enough, resistance stops being bravery and starts being waste. But humans have never been very good at mathematics when something makes us angry enough. By the time I left the monitoring station and caught the shuttle back to Earth, the news had reached every corner of the planet. There were no riots. There were no panic lines or mass evacuations. People stood in streets and watched the sky and talked to each other in low, serious voices. There were arguments, yes. There were people who said we should reconsider, that we should negotiate, that 14 months was enough time to find a smarter path forward. Those people were not wrong to say so. They were not cowards. They were practical, and practicality is a virtue. But they lost the argument before it was finished. Not because anyone silenced them. Not because the governments of Earth made a unilateral decision without consulting the people. They lost because, one by one, even the most cautious voices in the room eventually went quiet and stared at that two-word response on the screen and felt the same thing I had felt in my chair on the moon. That hot coal in the chest. That old, wordless thing with no clean name. Eleanor Vos held a global address 48 hours after the Herald ship left. It was the most watched broadcast in human history. She stood in front of no flags, no symbols, no grand backdrop. Just a plain wall and a camera and herself. She spoke for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. She said that humanity had received a demand, and that humanity had refused it, and that the refusal was going to have consequences, and that those consequences needed to be faced with open eyes and no pretending. She said this was not a moment for speeches about glory or destiny. She said this was a moment for honesty. She said, "We do not know if we can win. But we know what we are, and we know what we are not, and we are not a species that pays tribute to anyone who arrives in a large enough ship and expects compliance." She said, "We are going to need 60 days. And every single one of those days is going to count." Then she ended the broadcast. I sat in a cafeteria in Geneva and watched the reaction on a wall screen. For a moment there was silence. Not the silence of shock. The silence of a held breath. And then, slowly, something moved across the face of every person in that room, something that was not quite a smile and not quite determination but lived in the space between them. We had 60 days before the compliance delegation arrived. We were not going to spend them waiting. The first thing you need to understand is that humanity had been lying to the galaxy for a very long time. Not maliciously. Not with any coordinated plan, at least not at first. It began simply enough, back in the days when our long-range telescopes first started picking up the faint traces of Imperium communication signals. That was nearly 2 centuries before Owen Garrett sat in his chair on the moon and watched the Herald ship arrive. 2 centuries of listening. 2 centuries of slowly, carefully learning the shape of what was out there. My name is Clara Ashworth. I was Director of Strategic Preparedness for the Earth Defense Commission, which was an organization that officially did not exist. If you had searched for it in any public database before the day Eleanor Vos gave her 4-minute address, you would have found nothing. The EDC had operated in the deepest layer of governmental secrecy for 112 years, funded through a system of budget allocation so carefully disguised that even most heads of government did not know where the money was going. I had inherited the directorship from a man named George Fallon, who had inherited it from a woman named Patricia Dunn, and so on, back through 11 directors to the original founders, a small group of scientists and military strategists who had listened to those first alien signals in the early days and made a decision. The decision was this: the galaxy was not safe. The galaxy was dominated by something large and organized and clearly accustomed to getting what it wanted. And humanity, small and young and noisy and obvious, was going to be noticed eventually. So they started preparing. Quietly. Without fanfare. Without public speeches or international agreements that might be intercepted. They built things and hid them and kept building. They trained people and kept training. They studied every fragment of alien technology they could extract from those signals, and they reverse-engineered what they could, and they improved on what they reverse-engineered, and they kept that quiet too. By the time Owen's message landed on Eleanor Vos's desk, humanity was not what the Imperium thought it was. We were not a Tier 3 species scrambling to organize a defense. We had been ready, in our quiet way, for a very long time. Not fully ready. Nobody is ever fully ready for something like this. But ready enough. Owen came to see me the morning after Eleanor's broadcast. He was brought into the EDC through a side entrance of a building in Geneva that publicly housed a telecommunications regulatory office. He came in looking like a man who had not slept in 2 days, which was accurate, and who was still processing what he had seen through the observation glass on the moon, which was also accurate. I showed him the files. Not all of them. There was not time for all of them. But enough. I showed him the shipyard records, the ones hidden inside the atmosphere of Jupiter, where the pressure and the cloud cover made orbital surveillance from outside the solar system essentially impossible. We had been building ships there for 80 years. They were not elegant. They were not the kind of ships that the Imperium would recognize as warships, because they did not look like any warship the Imperium had ever seen. They were built around a completely different philosophy of what a warship should do. Owen sat across from me at the table in my office and looked at the schematics for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "How long have you known?" I said, "The organization has known for over a century." He said, "And nobody told us." I said, "We told the people who needed to know." The secrecy was not deception for its own sake. It was protection. If the Imperium had been monitoring us more closely, any public military buildup would have triggered exactly the response we just received, but without 60 days of preparation time. The silence bought us something. He looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded. Not because he thought everything was fine, but because he understood the logic, and understanding the logic was enough for Owen Garrett. He was that kind of person. Practical when it mattered. I showed him the weapons programs next. Not the technical details, which would have taken weeks to explain, but the broad outlines. We had spent 112 years studying how the Imperium fought, and the picture that emerged from that study was both reassuring and sobering. Reassuring because the Imperium fought in a way that was deeply conventional. They had not needed to adapt in centuries. Every species they had ever faced had either submitted without a fight or fought in the ways that species at their level of development always fought, which was to say, predictably. The Imperium's military was enormous and well-equipped and experienced, but it was not creative. It had not needed to be. Sobering because enormous and well-equipped and experienced was still an almost incomprehensible advantage. But here is the thing about humans that I had spent my career thinking about. We do not have one way of fighting. We have thousands. We have been fighting each other for as long as we have existed, and every time one side developed an advantage, the other side found a way around it. We learned deception because we had to. We learned to strike from unexpected directions because survival demanded it. We learned to be patient and to be relentless and to use the terrain and to feign weakness and to absorb punishment and keep moving, because all of those things had been necessary at one point or another in our long and complicated history. The Imperium had never fought anything like us. They did not know that yet. Owen asked me what the plan was. I told him there were 17 separate plans, because I had never been comfortable relying on one. The plans ranged from a pure defensive strategy, pulling our forces back and making Earth as costly as possible to approach, to a full offensive strike designed to hit the compliance delegation before it ever reached our system. Between those two extremes were 15 variations, each built around different assumptions about what the Imperium would do and how fast they would do it. He asked me which one I thought we would use. I said, the one that starts with letting them think they still have the advantage. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That sounds like every war story I have ever read." I said, "That is because it works." The 60 days moved fast. They always do when there is real work to be done. Owen joined the EDC formally, given a rank that did not officially exist in any military structure, and he was given a ship. Not the largest ship we had. The largest ships were being kept elsewhere. He was given a fast, maneuverable vessel that his crew had privately named the Resolute, though no name appeared on any official register. His crew of 42 had been training for years without knowing exactly what they were training for. They knew now. Across the solar system, quietly and without announcement, the fleet moved into position. I want to be honest about those 60 days. They were not all confidence and resolve. There were nights when I sat in my office and stared at the resource projections and felt the weight of what we were attempting. The Imperium controlled thousands of star systems. They had fleets we had never fully counted. They had been doing this for centuries. We were one species on one planet in one solar system, and we had told them no. The math was not comfortable. But I had read enough history to know that the math has been uncomfortable before. I had read enough to know that the side with the most ships does not always win, and that the side that has been fighting longer does not always win, and that the side that looks larger from the outside is not always larger where it counts. The compliance delegation arrived 4 days early. We were ready. The global declaration of war was transmitted galaxy-wide at 0600 hours Earth Standard Time. It was long. It named every species the Imperium had ever brought under its control and every planet it had ever stripped of its resources and every culture it had ever erased from history. It named the coordinates of 17 classified Imperium fleet staging grounds that we had identified through a century of signal analysis. It described, in plain language, exactly what the Imperium had done and exactly what we intended to do about it. The final paragraph was short. It said, "We are not asking you to stop. We are informing you that we are going to make you stop. We have decided this not in anger, not in desperation, but in full awareness of what it means. We are humanity. We have been here before. We know how this works." The galaxy went very quiet. Then it started watching. Eleanor Voss stood at the window of the Geneva office and looked at the sky for a long time after the transmission went out. I stood beside her and did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say. She finally spoke. She said, "Do you think they understand what is coming?" I said, "No. I do not think they do." She nodded slowly. She said, "Good. Neither did we, once." The compliance delegation reached the outer edge of our solar system at 0900 hours. They did not transmit any warnings or demands. They assumed, I think, that our declaration had been a final act of defiance, something symbolic, something to preserve our dignity before we surrendered. They were moving toward Earth in formation when we hit them. The first engagement lasted 11 minutes. The compliance delegation ceased to exist at 0911. We did not celebrate. There was no time. What we had just done was throw a stone at something very large, and now we had to deal with what came next. Owen Garrett sat in his command chair aboard the Resolute and looked at the sensor readings, and then he looked at his crew, and he said the same thing he always said before anything difficult. He said, "All right. Let us get to work." The Imperium called what they sent next the 9th Pacification Armada. I know the name because we intercepted the orders. 800 warships, drawn from 3 of their core fleet groups, redirected from their current assignments and pointed toward a single small yellow star on the outer edge of the galaxy. The commander of the 9th was an Imperium officer named, in rough translation, the Unyielding One, which told you something about how seriously they were now taking us. They were not taking us seriously enough. My name is Owen Garrett. You know my name by now. I was the one who watched the Herald ship arrive from a window on the moon, the one who sent the quiet message to the Secretary General's office, the one who met Clara Ashworth in Geneva and looked at schematics for ships hidden inside Jupiter's atmosphere. I had been given command of a small fast attack vessel with 42 crew, a ship we called the Resolute, and I had spent the 60 days of preparation drilling my crew on the tactics that Clara's organization had spent decades developing. We were one of 43 vessels in our forward screening group. Fast ships, lightly armored, designed not to stand and exchange fire with large warships but to move, to confuse, to be somewhere other than where the enemy expected. The 9th Armada dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of our system on a Thursday. I was eating breakfast when the alarm went off. I put down my fork and walked to the command deck and looked at the sensor board, and the sensor board looked back at me with 800 red signals, each one representing a vessel considerably larger than mine. A crew member named Patrick Lane, who handled sensor analysis, turned around in his chair and looked at me. He was 26 years old and had been born on a station in the asteroid belt and had never been to Earth's surface. He said, in a very calm voice, "Sir, they brought a lot of ships." I said, "They always do." He said, "Are we going to be all right?" I said, "We are going to be busy." Which is basically the same thing. He turned back to his console. Here is what the Imperium expected. They expected to find a loose cluster of human vessels positioned defensively around Earth, probably in a sphere formation, trying to look as large as possible. They expected us to broadcast a final challenge, which was the protocol that every species had followed. Announce yourself. Give the enemy one last chance to see reason. Then fight. This is how it was always done. We did not announce ourselves. We did not form a sphere around Earth. We were already inside their formation before their lead ships finished decelerating from faster-than-light travel. The transition out of FTL leaves every ship momentarily vulnerable, a period that lasts between 30 and 90 seconds depending on the vessel's size. Larger ships need longer to stabilize. The Ninth Armada's largest ships needed close to 2 minutes. Clara's people had known this for 40 years. They had built our attack doctrine entirely around that window. The Resolute hit 3 vessels in the first pass, using a type of targeting system that had taken 18 years to develop, built on principles that the Imperium's weapons engineers had apparently never considered. We were past them before their point defense systems could respond, turning hard into the debris field of one of their own ships to break their targeting solution, and then we were in among the next row of vessels. I want to be clear about something. This was not easy. It was not a simple victory. 3 of our 43 ships were lost in the first hour, hit by weapons fire from Imperium vessels that were adapting faster than we had hoped. The crew of those ships were people I knew. Patrick Lane had friends aboard one of them. He did not stop working. None of them did. The Imperium's formations were built for a different kind of battle. They were designed to present overwhelming firepower in a concentrated direction, to make the enemy feel the weight of them, to give the enemy a moment to reconsider. Those formations assumed the enemy would stay at a distance and trade fire, because that was what enemies always did. We went through them. Not around them. Through them. Into the gaps between their ships, into ranges so close that their larger weapons could not track us without risking hitting their own vessels. We were smaller and faster, and we had trained specifically for this, and for the first 3 hours of the engagement, the Ninth Armada was fighting a battle their entire military history had not prepared them for. They adapted. I want to be honest about that too. The unyielding one was a capable commander. By the 4th hour, the Imperium formations had broken apart into smaller independent groups, removing the vulnerability we had been exploiting. They started using their smaller escort vessels differently, pushing them forward to create a screen that was harder to penetrate. They were learning in real time, adjusting under pressure, which was not what we had expected from a military that had not needed to adapt in centuries. It made things harder. It also made me respect them in a way I had not expected to. Patrick Lane updated the sensor board at the start of Hour 6 and told me that we had reduced the Ninth Armada from 800 vessels to approximately 540. He said it in a flat voice, the voice of someone reporting a number rather than a victory, because we had also lost 9 of our 43 ships by that point, and none of us were in the mood to celebrate. I told him to run a projection on the current rate of loss for both sides and tell me where the lines crossed. He ran it. He looked at the result. He said, "They break before we do. But it is closer than it should be." I said, "Close is close enough." What changed in Hour 8 was something Clara had predicted but had not been certain of. The Imperium fleet had been operating on the assumption that our solar system contained only the ships they could see. It had not occurred to them to look harder, because no species they had ever faced had successfully hidden a reserve fleet inside the atmosphere of a gas giant. Our reserve fleet came out of Jupiter at 1,700 hours. 112 ships, larger than anything in our forward screening group, moving at speeds that the Imperium's tactical computer probably classified as impossible for vessels their size. They had been designed for exactly this moment, built to transition from a gas giant's high-pressure environment directly into combat without the usual preparation time. They arrived behind the Ninth Armada's adjusted formations, which meant that the screen the unyielding one had carefully constructed was now facing the wrong direction. The next 3 hours were the hardest fighting of the entire engagement. The Imperium did not collapse. They fought back with everything they had. They were disciplined and they were experienced, and they did not give up easily. We lost 7 more ships. Patrick Lane lost 2 more friends, and he sat at his console with his jaw tight and his hands steady and kept working. At 2011 hours, the Ninth Armada's command ship went silent. The remaining Imperium vessels, approximately 90 ships out of the original 800, disengaged and moved to FTL. We let them go. Not because we were feeling generous, but because we needed them to go back and report. We needed the Imperium to understand what had happened here. We needed them to hear it from their own people rather than read it in our transmissions, which they might dismiss as propaganda. The battle was over. Total elapsed time, 11 hours and 9 minutes. I sat in my command chair after the last Imperium ship vanished from the sensor board, and I looked at my crew. 32 of my original 42 were still with me. The other 10 had gone with their ships into the dark. I did not make a speech. I am not a man who makes speeches. I said their names, all 10 of them, quietly and in order, and my crew sat still and listened. Then I said that we were going to take 4 hours for damage control and crew rest, and then we were going to begin the next phase of the operation. Nobody asked what the next phase was. They already knew. The silence that followed the battle was, as I said in my earlier account, the loudest thing I have ever experienced. For 72 hours after the 9th Armada withdrew, there was almost no communication traffic on any of the Imperium frequencies we monitored. Not silence from space, the natural quiet of distance and vacuum, but silence from them. From their ships. From their stations. From their military command networks. They were thinking. We did not give them long to think. The declaration of war had been transmitted before the battle. The battle had been the demonstration. The next message we sent was shorter than the declaration, and it went to every frequency simultaneously, the same way we always sent things now. It said, "We are coming. Not for revenge. Not for conquest. We are coming because someone has to, and we have decided that someone is us." Then we moved. The Resolute and the surviving ships of our forward group fell in behind the reserve fleet, resupplied and repaired during the transit, and headed outward from our solar system toward the first of the Imperium's regional command stations. Along the way we passed through 4 systems that the Imperium listed as tributary territories, small civilizations that had been paying their quotas and keeping their heads down and hoping not to be noticed. Patrick Lane was watching the sensors as we passed through the first of those systems. He said, "They are watching us." I said, "I know." He said, "They look afraid." I said, "That is normal. Give it time." We kept moving. We had been in transit for 6 days when the first message came in. It was transmitted on a frequency that had not been active in over 200 years, an old signal band that predated Imperium control of that region of space. The translation software took longer than usual, because the language was different from anything in our primary database. My name is Clara Ashworth, and I was monitoring communications aboard the Fleet Command vessel when the message came through. Owen was on his own ship, 3,000 kilometers off our port side, and I patched him in immediately. The message was from a species called, as best as we could translate, the Tal Sereth. They were native to a system 6 light-years from our current position. They had been under Imperium control for 140 years. The message said, "We see you. We have seen what you did at the Yellow Star. We want you to know that we have not forgotten what we were before they came." Owen's voice came through the comm. He said, "Respond. Tell them we see them too." I sent the reply. There was a long pause. Then the Tal Sereth sent a second message. It said, "We will handle our own system. Do not slow down on our account." We did not slow down. But we brought what we could spare. We transmitted everything we had on Imperium fleet movements in their region, every weakness in the control station network we had identified, every piece of technical information we thought they could use. We did not do it because we expected something in return. We did it because they asked for nothing and still chose to stand up, and that deserved to be honored. The Tal Sereth system went active 2 days later. The Imperium control station there stopped transmitting. We were 3 systems deeper into Imperium territory when the second message came, this one from a species calling themselves the Veth. Then a third, from an unnamed people who communicated only in mathematical sequences but whose meaning was entirely clear. Then a fourth. A fifth. The Imperium had spent centuries building a structure of control held together primarily by the certainty that resistance was impossible. The certainty was the control. Remove the certainty, and the structure began to loosen from the inside. We had removed the certainty. Owen and I met by video link on the 7th day of transit. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. He looked like a man carrying a weight that kept growing and who had decided the answer was to keep walking rather than put it down. He said, "How many now?" I said, 9 confirmed. 3 more probable within the next 48 hours. He said, "Do you think the Imperium understands what is happening?" I said, They understand that their tributary systems are destabilizing. I do not think they understand why. They have probably never had to think about why before. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "What does your latest assessment say about their core fleet response time?" I had been dreading that question because the answer had changed since the last time I had given it to him. Our signal intercepts from the past 48 hours suggested the Imperium was mobilizing something considerably larger than the Ninth Armada. Not another pacification force. Something they apparently reserved for situations they classified as existential. I told him the number. He did not react visibly. He just looked at the middle distance for a few seconds. Then he said, "How long do we have before they get here?" I said, 22 days if they move directly. Longer if they have to deal with the tributary disruptions along the way. He said, "Then we have 22 days to reach something worth reaching." The Imperium's core territory was not a single location. It was a cluster of 28 systems linked by the oldest and most stable faster-than-light routes in this region of the galaxy. At the center of that cluster was a world that translated roughly as the seat. It was the administrative and symbolic center of everything the Imperium had built over 4 centuries of expansion. The Emperor, who was less an individual and more a title held by a council of senior commanders, operated from the seat. We were heading for the seat. Not to destroy it. That distinction matters, and I want it recorded clearly. We did not have the capacity to destroy a heavily fortified world, nor would we have chosen that approach even if we had. Civilian populations live on worlds like that. They live under the governments they are given, and they do not deserve to answer for what those governments do. Our target was the military and command infrastructure, not the people. It was a distinction the Imperium apparently found difficult to understand, because it was not a distinction they had ever made themselves. Day 9 of transit brought a transmission directly to our fleet command frequency. It came from an Imperium official whose title translated as the Grand Negotiator, which was a title the Imperium used when they wanted to talk but did not want to appear to be asking. The Grand Negotiator said, "The Eternal Galactic Imperium is prepared to discuss a revised tributary arrangement for the human species, one that takes into account the demonstrated capabilities of your military forces." I drafted the reply myself and had Eleanor Voss review it before we sent it. It said, "The human species is not interested in a revised tributary arrangement. The human species is not interested in any tributary arrangement. We are prepared to discuss a complete dismantling of the tributary system, full sovereignty restoration for all currently held species, and a new framework for interstellar relations built on something other than compelled submission. We are happy to have that conversation at a time and place of mutual convenience. We suggest you think carefully about what mutual convenience means while we continue our current course." The Grand Negotiator did not reply for 11 hours. When the reply came, it was short. It said, "Your course is noted." We kept moving. Day 14 brought us to the edge of the Seraph cluster, the outermost ring of core Imperium systems. The fleet we encountered there was not a pacification force. It was a standing defensive wall, ships arranged in overlapping formations across every viable approach vector. Whoever had designed the formation was not underestimating us this time. They had clearly studied the records from the Ninth Armada engagement and made adjustments. The battle that followed lasted 3 days. I will not describe all of it. Some of it I did not see directly, only through sensor feeds and after-action reports. What I will say is this: it was the hardest 3 days of my life, and of Owen's life, and of the lives of everyone in our fleet. We lost ships and we lost people, and there were moments when the projections on my board looked very dark, and I sat in my chair and ran the numbers again and looked for the path through. There was always a path. Sometimes it was narrow. Sometimes it required things I did not enjoy requiring. But it was always there. On the 3rd day, the defensive wall broke. Not collapsed, not routed, but methodically dismantled, section by section, as we found and exploited each gap in their coverage. The remaining Imperium ships withdrew to the inner systems. We followed. And that was when the other thing happened. The thing that none of our projections had specifically anticipated, though Clara had always said something like it might. The 14 species that had already risen against Imperium control in their own systems began moving. Not toward us. They had their own targets, their own regional Imperium installations that had held them down for generations. But the timing was not a coincidence. They had been watching our progress. They had made their own decisions about when to act. The Imperium was no longer fighting one war. It was fighting many. Owen sent me a brief message on day 15. It contained no words, just a set of coordinates and an arrival time. I looked at the coordinates and understood immediately. The capital system of the seat was 11 days away. The Imperium's grand mobilization, the massive counterfleet they had been assembling, reached us 6 days later in the transit corridor between the Sereth cluster and the inner core. It was large. It was the largest single military force I had ever seen on a sensor board, and I had been looking at sensor boards for a long time. But it was late. It was reacting. We had been moving and they had been responding, and no matter how large a force is, it fights at a disadvantage when it is always one step behind the tempo of the battle. Clara had taught me that. Her organization had spent a century learning it from human history, and now we were teaching it to the Imperium in real time. The engagement lasted 4 days. It was brutal and costly, and I do not want to describe it in more detail than necessary. At the end of it, the Imperium's grand mobilization had been reduced by 60% and was in full withdrawal. We came out of that battle slower than we had entered it. Damaged ships, depleted crew. We took 4 days to repair what could be repaired and honor those we had lost, and then Owen transmitted a fleet-wide message. He said, "Final approach begins in 6 hours. Everyone get some rest." I looked out the observation window of the fleet command vessel at the stars ahead, and somewhere in the middle distance, hidden by distance and not yet visible on the standard sensors, was the seat. The sky on the horizon of that world was orange with the light of its parent star. From our approach vector, far out, it looked warm. I did not feel warm about it. I felt ready. Which, for this particular moment in this particular story, was the same thing. The capital system of the seat had a name in Imperium language that translated loosely as the center of all that is ordered, which told you everything you needed to know about how the Imperium thought of itself. It had 22 orbital defense platforms, 3 standing fleet groups, an anti-approach weapon array that covered every conventional entry vector into the system. It had been impregnable for 370 years. We came in through an unconventional vector. My name is Owen Garrett. I have been telling you this story for a while now, and you know the broad shape of how it went. You know that we made it here. What I want to tell you about is the 3 days before the ceasefire, because those 3 days were the ones that changed everything, not the battles, not the fleet engagements, not the long transit through contested space. The 3 days that mattered were the 3 days of quiet. The approach to the seat took 40 hours from the edge of the system. We came in on a vector that ran through a dense region of gravitational interference from a pair of brown dwarf companions at the system's outer edge. It was not a comfortable route. It was rough on the ships and rough on the crew. But the defense platforms were calibrated for standard entry vectors, and a ship moving through that much gravitational noise appeared on their sensors as natural interference rather than a fleet. Patrick Lane sat at his console during those 40 hours and watched the readouts with the concentration of a man who understood very well what it would mean if he made an error. He did not make one. When we cleared the interference zone and the defense platforms were behind us, inside our perimeter rather than facing us, I watched the Imperium system command frequency go from routine traffic to sudden urgent chatter. They had seen us. They were reacting. The platforms were beginning to rotate. I gave the order to accelerate. We were not going to have much time. What happened next is recorded in detail elsewhere, and I am going to summarize it here because the technical details of a fleet engagement are not the story I am trying to tell. What I will say is that the 3 standing fleet groups inside the seat system had clearly been briefed on everything the Imperium knew about how we fought, and they fought us very differently from the 9th Armada. They were careful. They kept distance. They tried to deny us the close-range maneuvering space that we had used so effectively before. It was a good strategy. It cost us more than any engagement since the Sereth cluster. But we had something they did not, and that was the 17 species now fighting alongside us or fighting independently against Imperium positions throughout their territory, pulling Imperium resources and attention in directions the system command here could not fully compensate for. The seat was the center of everything, and the center was being asked to function while the edges were burning. On the second day of the engagement, one of the standing fleet groups withdrew from its position to respond to a crisis 3 systems away, where the Tal Sereth and 2 allied species had taken an Imperium shipyard complex that had been supplying this very system. The remaining 2 fleet groups were not enough. By the end of day 2, we controlled the orbital space above the seat. We did not bombard the surface. I want to be absolutely clear about that, and I want you to understand that it was not a difficult decision. We were not there to destroy a civilization. We were there to end a system of control. Those are different things, and the difference matters more than almost anything else I could say in this account. Clara sent a transmission to the surface on the morning of day 3. It was addressed to the Emperor's Council, the governing body of the Eternal Galactic Imperium. It said that we controlled their orbital space. It said that we had the ability to disrupt every supply chain, every communication link, every logistical system that connected the seat to the rest of the Imperium. It said that we could continue the war from this position indefinitely, while their territory continued to fracture around them. It said, "Where you can talk to us." The response came 4 hours later. It said, "Send a representative." Clara looked at me over the video link and said, "It should be you. You were the one at the window on the moon." I said, "You built the organization that made this possible." She said, "I know. But you are the one who told Eleanor Voss we needed a different response template. That is where this started. It should end with you in the room." I thought about arguing. I decided she was right. The ceasefire negotiation was held on a neutral station in the outer part of the seat system, a small administrative platform that had been used for trade arbitration in the years before the Imperium had decided it no longer needed to arbitrate with anyone. It was old and slightly cold, and the lighting was wrong for human eyes, adjusted downward for alien visual preferences. I brought a translation system and a single document and nothing else. The Grand Consul was already there when I arrived. I had seen images of the species he belonged to, tall and angular with large amber eyes and a stillness that suggested either great calm or great age. He sat across from me at a table designed for a being his height, which meant I had to look up slightly, which I suspected was intentional. He looked at me for a long time without speaking. I let him look. Then he said, through the translation system, in a voice that was low and measured, "You are younger than I expected." I said, "Our species is young. That is something people keep underestimating." He said, "Yes. I am beginning to understand that." He looked down at the table for a moment. Then he said, "You have placed our capital under effective blockade. You have destabilized 14 of our tributary systems. You have reduced 3 of our primary fleet groups to fragments. You have done all of this in less than 4 months. I have held this position for 3 centuries, and I have never seen anything like it." I said, "I know." He said, "What do you want?" I slid the document across the table. He looked at it for a long time. It was 12 pages. Every page was dense with detail. He read it without expression, turning each page carefully, going back occasionally to reread a section. It took him 40 minutes. When he finished, he looked up at me and said, "This does not name any human demands." I said, "That is correct." He said, "It names demands on behalf of 417 other species." I said, "Also correct." He said, "You fought a 4-month war that nearly broke the Imperium, and you are asking for nothing for yourselves." I said, "We are asking for the right to be left alone." Which is not nothing. But I take your meaning. We are primarily asking on behalf of the species that could not ask for themselves. He was quiet for a long time. He said, "I do not understand your species." I said, "You do not need to understand us. You need to sign the document." He said, "If I sign this, the Imperium ceases to exist in its current form. The tributary system ends. Our control of 4 centuries of expansion ends. Do you understand what you are asking me to dissolve?" I said, "Yes. I understand exactly what I am asking you to dissolve. That is why I am asking you to dissolve it." He looked at the document again. He looked at the first page, which began with a list of species names. All 417 of them. He said, very quietly, "We never thought of them as being capable of this." I said, "No. You thought of them the way you thought of us. As things that could be managed." He said, "And we were wrong." I said, "You were wrong." He said, "What happens if we do not sign?" I said, "We continue the blockade. The tributary disruptions continue. The species that have already reclaimed their autonomy will defend it. You will spend the next decade fighting a war on every border you have, with resources that grow smaller every month, against opponents who are learning very quickly that the certainty you built your control on was false. You will lose. It will take longer and it will be worse for everyone, including the people on the surface of that world below us who did nothing wrong and deserve better than to watch their civilization consume itself. He said, "You are giving me a choice between two kinds of loss." I said, "I am giving you a choice between ending it now, with something left to build from, or ending it later, with nothing." He looked at me for a long moment. His amber eyes were very still. Then he said, "What becomes of the Imperium after the document is signed?" I said, "That is not my decision. It is the decision of every species you have been governing without their consent. We will facilitate conversations. We will help establish whatever new frameworks they choose. We will share technology that makes independent travel and communication possible for civilizations that have been dependent on your infrastructure. But we will not build the new thing for them. It belongs to them." He said, "And humanity?" I said, "Humanity goes home. We have a lot of repairs to do." He almost smiled. I could not be certain, because his face was not built the way mine was. But something in his expression shifted, just slightly, in a way that felt like the beginning of something close to a smile. He said, "You are very strange creatures." I said, "So we have been told." He picked up the marking instrument on his side of the table. He held it over the last page of the document. He looked at me one more time. He said, "Do you believe this will work?" I said, "I believe it has a better chance of working than anything else available to us." He said, "That is not a confident answer." I said, "No. But it is an honest one." He signed. I sat there for a moment after the ink was down. I looked at his signature and at the 12 pages of the document and at the empty table between us, and I thought about Eleanor Voss standing at a window looking at the sky and about Patrick Lane saying, "Sir, they brought a lot of ships." I thought about the 10 people I had lost from my crew and the 23 more we had lost in the subsequent engagements, and the crews of the ships we had lost, and the Tal Sereth who had said we will handle our own system and had meant it. I thought about the fact that in 200 years of quiet preparation, humanity had built something enormous and hidden it carefully and waited, and the waiting had been its own kind of courage, maybe the harder kind, and the people who had done that waiting would never be fully known because their work had required secrecy and secrecy erases names. The Grand Consul stood up. He was much taller standing than sitting, and I had to look up at him properly now. He looked down at me with those still amber eyes. He said, "For what it is worth, I believe this was the correct outcome." I said, "For what it is worth, so do I." I picked up the signed document and walked out of the station. The shuttle back to the Resolute took about 20 minutes. I sat in the passenger compartment and looked out the window at the stars, which looked the same as they always looked, indifferent and enormous and scattered across the dark without any particular concern for what the small creatures moving among them were doing. Patrick Lane met me at the docking bay. He was holding a cup of coffee, which he held out to me without a word. I took it. He said, "Well." I said, "It is done." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "Was it what you expected?" I said, "I expected him to be angrier." He was mostly tired. I think he had been carrying it for a long time. Patrick thought about that. Then he said, "What happens now?" I said, "Now the real work starts. The hard work. The kind that does not have clear victories or obvious progress. The kind that takes generations and nobody makes stories about." He said, "Is that worse than this?" I said, "It is different. It is the work of building something rather than ending something. It requires different people than the ones who are good at battles." He said, "Are you one of those people?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "I do not know yet. I suppose I will find out." He nodded. He looked at the stars through the docking bay window. After a while he said, "My grandmother was born under the Imperium. Not under our sun. Under theirs. Her family was relocated to work a mining operation in a system they had never heard of. She died without ever going home." I said, "I know. A lot of people have stories like that." He said, "She would have liked today." I said, "Yes. I think she would have." We stood there for a while. The stars stayed the same, which was appropriate, because what had changed was not the stars. What had changed was who was free to move between them. Eleanor Vos gave a second global address 3 days after the ceasefire was signed. It was shorter than the first one. She stood in front of the same plain wall, with the same steady voice, and she said that the document had been signed, and that the tributary system was dissolved, and that the work ahead would be long and complicated and not glamorous, and that humanity was going to have to decide what kind of neighbor it wanted to be in a galaxy that was, for the first time in recorded history, genuinely open. She said, "We did not do this to become rulers. We did not do this to become heroes. We did this because there was something happening that was wrong, and we were in a position to stop it, and so we did." She said, "The galaxy is watching us now, the same way it watched us when we said no to that first demand. They are trying to understand what we are. They are going to keep trying for a long time." She said, "Let us make sure what they find is worth understanding." I watched her address from my cabin on the Resolute, which was at that point beginning the long journey home. I had a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and the lights in my cabin were set low, and outside the viewport the stars were moving in the way they always move when a ship is traveling, that slow sweep of light against dark that never stops being beautiful no matter how many times you see it. I thought about what the Grand Consul had said. That he did not understand our species. That we were strange creatures. I thought about Clara Ashworth building an organization in secret for a century, and about Eleanor Vos reading 2 words aloud in a steady voice, and about the Tal Sereth saying we will handle our own system, and about Patrick Lane sitting at his console with his jaw tight and his hands steady while the battle raged and he did not have any way to know how it would end. We are strange creatures, I thought. We absolutely are. We do not like being told what to do. We do not accept the premise that size alone grants authority. We have a tendency, when faced with something impossible, to get very quiet and very focused and start looking for the path through, because we have always believed there is a path, and we have been right often enough to keep believing it. We also, and this is the part that the galaxy had not accounted for, tend to ask other people along. Not because we need them. Not because we cannot manage alone. But because the path is longer than one person can walk, and the work is larger than one species can do, and because there is something in us, something old and persistent and difficult to explain, that sees someone being treated as less than they are and simply cannot let it stand. The Imperium had called it irrationality. The Grand Consul had called it strange. Patrick Lane's grandmother had called it, in the language of her people, something that translated roughly as the fire in the chest that will not go out. I thought that was probably the best description I had ever heard. The Resolute moved through the dark between stars, heading home, carrying 32 people who had earned their rest and were not going to take very much of it, because there was work to do. There is always work to do. That is the thing about building something, as opposed to ending something. It is never finished. But that is also what makes it worth doing. I finished my cold coffee and turned off the cabin light and looked at the stars. They had not changed. Not even a little. But we had. And this time, the galaxy was going to have to learn to keep up.